Oh, whoops. I'll leave my book out there. Folks, I'm a mess today. I'm all over the place. Alright, this is my third attempt to make a video today, so let's get it done, friends. Let's get it done. What's up, Cooligans? It's the Coolian here, and today we are talking Aperture. Yo. So, I'm gonna be honest, I'm a little nervous for this video because Aperture can get complicated. I'm gonna have to kind of force myself to not go too deep into certain aspects of it, because then it just becomes super confusing and convoluted and not really necessary. So as I had done with my focal length video, by the way, link up there, I'm gonna just be more so focusing on the creative effects that Aperture has on your picture, and less to do with the science and math behind it. We gotta do a little bit. So let's get started. Friends, what's Aperture? Let me tell you. Aperture is the hole inside your lens. Simple as that. It's the hole in your lens through which light goes in and hits the sensor. But that hole... try not to vomit everywhere, Julian. But that hole in the lens can change in size. And that's a choice that you can make as a filmmaker as to what size that hole is. And that size has a different effect on your image. So the aperture of a lens is actually made of a bunch of different leaves that are closing. It's these metal leaves, if you take a look in there, that open and close. Now the scale through which we measure aperture is probably the most confusing part of it. It's not measured as we would hope is like 5 or 6 or 7. It's not as linear as that. It is actually measured in what's called stops. And stops is a measurement of light. So you're gonna see a scale of aperture popping up on the screen right now. I hope I did it right. Did I do it right? And those are each what's called a full stop jump. And then there's third increments between there. So that's the scale. Now, what do those numbers mean scientifically? Let's move that aside for now. If you're interested, at the end of this video, you should check out a video made by Gerald Undone. It is a very math-heavy, science-heavy video explaining it. If you're curious and want to give yourself a brain teaser, then check it out. Link is in the description below. But what is important to know? Well, the important thing to know is that the lower the number is, and this is the confusing part, the thing that people always get mixed up. The lower the number is, the wider the aperture is. That means the bigger the hole is. The higher the number is, the smaller the hole is. Now, different lenses will have different minimum and maximum aperture numbers, but we can get into that later. But what does it do, Julian? How does it affect your picture? There's two key things that it does to your picture. The first one is a bit more obvious. As you open up the hole in your lens, it's going to let in more light. Think of it almost like your pupil. When it's really dark, your pupils adjust by increasing its size to let in more light. Well, that might be a reason why you change the aperture of your lens. Maybe it's really dark and I don't know what happened there. Maybe it's really dark. And that was a bit more normal. That was good. Maybe it's a bit more dark and you need to let in more light. You're shooting in a low light situation. While opening up your aperture is a way to let in more light to be able to adjust other settings. Maybe you want to shoot with a faster shutter speed. That's a way to compensate for it. Maybe the opposite. Maybe it's so bright outside because you're shooting a portrait outside that you need to cut the amount of light that you're letting in because your pictures are coming in too bright, or your video is coming too bright. Well, you close down the aperture and it'll let in less light. Side note, that's a little lingo that I've been kind of throwing in there without fully explaining, but the lingo in the biz for increasing the size of your aperture or decreasing it is opening up or closing. So open up the aperture, close down the aperture. Open up, lower number, more light. Close down, higher number, less light. Now the second and maybe more creative effect that your aperture has on your image, whether it's photo or video, it is your depth of field. Let's say you're focusing on an object. let's say it's my eye. Your depth of field is how much is in focus in front of and behind that as well. If you have a shallow depth of field, it means that that range is going to be very small. However, a greater depth of field, if you're focusing on my eye, my nose, my ears will be in focus as well, but so will the background. If you had a super shallow depth of field, it'd be just my eye, my nose would be out of focus, my ear would be out of focus. It's very selective. And so, how does aperture affect that? When you open up your aperture, when you make it wider and you accept more light in, it also reduces how much is in focus. And if you close down, it increases how much is in focus. Now, why is that a creative choice? Well, let's say the subject in your frame is the most important thing, and we don't want to have too much distraction in the background. Well, that would be an opportunity to open up your aperture and try to knock that stuff out of focus. However, if you're doing something like an establishing shot of a scene, or a landscape shot, and you want to have a lot more in focus because there's not one single point of interest, then you could close down your aperture and be able to see a lot more. So when you're describing a lens, generally you're describing the focal length and the aperture. And when you say that I have a 50 millimeter 1.4, what does that mean? That means the focal length is 50 millimeters and the widest the lens can go is 1.4. It basically says how fast the lens is. A fast lens has a lower aperture. Now, fun fact, fixed or prime lenses usually have the ability to open up wider. It has a wider aperture than zoom lenses. So that's one reason maybe why you would choose a prime lens over a zoom lens, because if it's prime, there's less moving pieces in it, so it's a lot easier for them to make a high quality, still focused image fully open. A lens's ability to work well at those open apertures is usually what determines the cost of a lens. So you might have a 1.4 lens that costs $300 or a 1.4 lens that costs $1,000. The difference usually being how well it performs at that aperture. How sharp is it at that focus point? Oh my god, I feel like I'm doing the exact opposite of what I said I was going to do, and I'm making this video complicated. So if you want to practice with the idea of aperture and how it affects your image, and you have a photo camera, almost all photo cameras have a semiotic, Jesus. Almost all cameras have a semiotic, twice. Oh boy. Almost all cameras have a semi-automatic mode called aperture priority, in which you choose your aperture and then everything else is kind of automatically adjusted by the camera until you get comfortable to using it in fully manual mode. And so what you can do is try taking some shots at the widest aperture. So remember, those are the lowest numbers. Take some shots at the widest aperture and see how that affects the background and the foreground, and notice how they're knocked out of focus. Then try to take some where the number is higher and thus the aperture is more closed, and then compare the two. You'll notice that the background is going to be a lot sharper than in the other one. Am I missing anything? That was a heavy one, friends. I hope that all made sense. Remember that the important part is not necessarily memorizing the numbers or fully understanding what those numbers represent scientifically. The most important artistic part is remembering how aperture affects your image. Aperture affects the amount of light coming in, but then also, more importantly, it affects your depth of field. A wider aperture, and thus a lower number, is a more selective depth of field, whereas a higher number and a smaller aperture has a much wider depth of field. I hope that was helpful. I know I'm exhausted. I can only imagine how you're feeling. You're the one that has to listen to me. Speaking of having to listen to me, why don't you subscribe to my channel? Give this video a like, comment if you have any questions, maybe this was entirely unhelpful and only made you more confused, or you have ideas for other topics that you want me to cover, put them in the comments. Friends, this is the Coolian signing off. I know a lot of you were really excited to see the cat again, and she's asleep on the bed. Classic D. Good morning! Oh, someone's a sleepyhead. D, what do you think of aperture? Are you a fan? Yep, that's you over there. That's you on the screen. Oh god, don't step on that.